Just to give you a bit of context, I'll introduce myself at a high level. I've spent the last 18 years in HR tech and recruiting, really helping people get access to opportunities by leveraging technology. And we build AI solutions to help individuals and executives have a thought partner so they can grow and overcome any challenges that they're finding in any transitional phases and also get to the next level of their career. And so Tunde gave you both a quick introduction. It obviously does not encompass your entire career. So Armani, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about who you are and yeah, some of the things that you've been doing around culture and brand. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, just very quickly. So I come from a storytelling background as a producer, director. My formative experience was at HBO during kind of the heyday of HBO, The Sopranos and The Wire era. But I worked mostly for HBO Sports as a producer, producing and directing documentaries. I was a senior producer for Real Sports. Left, started my own production company, and I work in different ways as executive producer, showrunner, but also have worked over the last decade with a lot of brands, some in the sports space, some outside of it, and really just helping them figure out storytelling. Because what happened is when I left HBO, it was the last time I held a physical piece of tape, because as soon as I left the doors, everything kind of became digital. So everyone was figuring out, all right, how do we tell stories? How do we do all of these things in the age of the internet during the early days of social media? And so what I did was kind of use some of my storytelling principles that I had learned kind of as a producer director, but adapt them to the digital age. So now I still produce and direct, but I usually work with a few brands. So FC Barcelona is one of them. I work with a prominent electrification nonprofit, and really just help them on kind of figuring out storytelling in our era.
Amazing. Thanks for sharing. And Kris.
Firstly, I want to say thank you to Robin and his team for asking myself and Armani and Marcus to be here. And for Marcus, thank you for pulling us into this as well. I'll start by just saying 28 years in the athletic footwear and apparel space. The last 13, I've worked for Nike Inc. I'm on my second tour of duty in Jordan brand. I've also worked for Nike brand as well as Converse, which is owned by Nike as well. I think the most important thing I want to share in this upfront process, I recently had a conversation with another leader in the enterprise, and they asked me what gets me up every day, what brings me to work. And I said, people. And what I mean by people is it's the teams that I've had the honor and privilege to lead, and I'd say also the consumers and communities that we have the privilege to serve. The most rewarding process that I've experienced in the 28 years I've been doing what I do is being part of the ideation process of building something, taking it through the funnel from concept to commercialization, and then seeing consumers open the box and seeing that hope in the box. The most rewarding part of my job outside of seeing people grow and be promoted.
Wow. So we've got two amazing panelists with experts in their field and have been part of building iconic brands. And we were having this discussion earlier around the distinction between an iconic brand and either a good or a great brand. So I want to ask you two, what's your definition of an iconic brand?
So I'm gonna jump in first, because one thing we never did when we were chatting outside is how do we want to frame up the criteria for what makes a brand iconic?
Okay.
Because there's household name brands, and then there's what we could call iconic brands, but that could be pretty subjective.
So I think for this session, we should focus on the top level iconic brands, and then we should work back into kind of then after that, how are you a household brand? Then maybe you're a new brand, an established brand, and go down that route, if that makes sense. What do you think? Does that work? Yeah. Okay, all right, we're gonna do that.
I think there's a number of formulas that can yield a brand the status of being iconic. I'm just gonna throw a few out that come to mind for me. One, I'll start with the Yankees. Yeah, it's funny that I actually grew up in Harlem and I could walk to Yankee Stadium. But one of the things that really makes that brand iconic is because it transcends culture. It's globally recognized. And the interesting thing about it that has made it a household name is the winning culture that they've always had, and that 5950, that thing, that lid that you see people walking around in the streets and have seen walking around in the streets for multiple decades. I'm also going to call out just my current employer. What's unique about Jordan Brand, unlike any other brand, most brands in our industry, actually no other brand in our industry has a living human being behind it. So when you think about that Jumpman logo, there is greatness tethered to it in the form of a human being that's been called the GOAT, that's been called Black Jesus, that's been called a myriad of names. But what's really important in calling out Jordan Brand is equally like the Yankees, the brand has transcended culture. The brand is truly a globally recognized brand. We're talking about a multi-billion-dollar organization that spans across footwear, apparel, accessories. But the most important part about Jordan Brand that gave it its iconic status, in my humble opinion, is it is the impetus for what I believe is a number of both macro and micro cultures. So it's rooted in basketball culture because Michael started his career and grew in that sport. But when you start thinking about the AJ1 that I'm wearing right here today, this was actually something that skaters gravitated towards in the 80s. And actually we're using it to skate bowls in Southern California. Like, who would have ever thought that counterculture would adopt a basketball silhouette and leverage it as, you know, their thing and build on that culture? When you think about hip hop culture and you think about the decades and decades of AJ 3s and 4s and 2s and 11s that you've seen adopted across that culture, it's also incredible. And I say the last point I'll make before I pass it off is when you think about a human being being synonymous with greatness, who else do you think about? Like, when you think about it, people leverage Michael as the symbol for what greatness is, i.e. Messi is the MJ of soccer, Lewis Hamilton is the MJ of Formula One, and so on and so forth. So that's just my initial take on what are some of the recipes and formulas for what would define a brand as being iconic.
So there's a lot there to unpack, and before Armani, you dive in and give your perspective, I think the thing that I've learned from all of our conversations is it's about that emotional connection, whether or not that is through MJ, but also not the emotional connection just from a high level, how you're perceived, but in deep rooted into what you're doing, whether or not we're talking about being in a playground or you're in schools, and how many people gravitate towards that and follow that. So I really appreciate you sharing that perspective. And it's also quite intimidating thinking about an iconic brand, maybe if you're in a startup now, like, how do you build that? And is there a formula in order to build that? So maybe we can touch on that after. But Armani, I'd love to get your perspective and take as well.
So this actually didn't come up in our conversation. I wasn't thinking about it because I think I take it for granted. You know, I spent 10 plus years at HBO, and it is now at the point where it's like at the bottom of my resume because, you know, a lot of stuff has happened over the last decade. But my HBO experience has profoundly sort of shaped my approach to other things. And when I think about when I was there during the time of, you know, HBO Sports, where I worked primarily, Sex and the City, The Sopranos, The Wire, it was such an iconic brand. And you almost see now, because it's showing a little bit of rust for, you know, unfortunately because of business reasons, that HBO doesn't have the prominence and the sort of centrality in the American consciousness that it had. But for so many people, it was kind of the epitome of, risk-taking, aggressive storytelling. I mean, there was nothing like The Sopranos before The Sopranos, and then it proceeded to shape television profoundly, really just shape the whole TV landscape. Just to use one example, The Wire, one of the greatest shows, in the history of television, as far as I'm concerned, and also incredibly influential. And no one, I mean, HBO barely did it. HBO tried to walk away from it after the first season, but it was something that you couldn't imagine anywhere else. So I think of that as really an iconic brand, something that, and sometimes people would assume things about the culture of HBO because of what they saw. So, we were talking a little bit about the difference between culture and brand, and I think culture is more, the behaviors within an organization that guide the way the organization behaves, and brand is really what people on the outside think. And HBO had definitely achieved iconic brand status.
Hold up.
No, you go ahead. You go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to jump this. I'm glad you brought this one up because it's funny. When I was on my way here, I was thinking about, for some reason, Blockbuster and Netflix, and I'm just curious.
You're trying to rent a video from Blockbuster. It's closed.
Well, no, it's like a really good case study of not evolving your business model, and it could have. I would imagine they had like thousands of retail doors, I'm sure, and I believe they were publicly traded. I have to believe they were in a positive cash position. They could have evolved by simply taking an acquisition route. Now, it's funny, I thought this in the last couple of decades, HBO, for some reason, like, where did they lose their footing? As I'm sure they had to see this digital era coming from down the street as well.
I almost blame M&A more than I blame them kind of failing to see the future. But you're right about that. One of the things when I was saying that people would look at HBO shows and they would say, "Oh my God, this is a progressive, forward, probably youthful company." But actually, that wasn't true. Like, people would stay for a very long time at HBO, so they would not replenish. They did not. There were young people who worked at HBO, but they did not necessarily. They did not necessarily take guidance from kind of the newer generations to kind of push it, because it didn't have to, because it had the problem that a lot of companies have with the innovator's dilemma. You're so successful for such a period of time that you have a blindness to your need to change and to evolve. So I think that's more what happened.
That's the Blockbuster Netflix story, right? In a nutshell. I was actually listening to a podcast the other day around that, and it kind of researched that. But yeah, so it seems to me, and from a lot of the conversations we've had, culture and brand, they're different, but they're very much tied into each other. And Kris, when you mentioned counterculture, and then we're talking about the skateboarders, and it seems to me that an amazing brand, and I'm not going to say iconic because I'm not sure that's correct, is able to capture a moment in time, or create a moment in time to then develop a brand. What's your perspective and opinion on that, as far as how you take what's going on outside and either galvanize that and create something brand new, or you galvanize that and ride the wave? Because I think, and the reason I say this is I've been having some conversations recently with a lot of chief people officers and different folks. There's a lot going on, as we know, outside of the four walls of any organization: remote work, social unrest, all this type of stuff. And people are trying to figure out what their identity is. And I think that culture of the identity ties very much to the brand. So what do you jump on and what do you not? How do you decide what your brand and your identity should be based on what's happening outside?
I'm gonna let the Nike guy start with that.
All right, so I'm gonna jump around a little bit because I think that this question is it's a hornet's nest, and I think it requires a little bit of unpacking.
Sorry, Kris.
No, it's all good. So I'd first say that it's important to just, and you've heard me say this before, Marcus, I think it's important just to give my perspective on what I believe culture means. It's as simple as it may sound. I believe culture means you were there. And what I mean by that is, like, when you think about the eras, and let's just use the last 40 years as a snapshot, and you think about the critical things that created critical mass it's all rooted in culture at the end of the day. The second part of culture, in just terms of defining it, is I truly believe that culture has always manifested and permeated from the struggle. So whether it's music in the Bronx at a block party with a DJ, and that it eventually becomes hip hop, or Steve Jobs sitting in his garage, probably eating mayonnaise sandwiches and building what is now a multi-$100 billion, if not $1 trillion market cap electronic company. So I just wanted to just level set and just share my thoughts on what culture is. Now, specific to tethering yourself to culture, I don't really believe you can tether yourself to culture. Like, you're either from it or you're not. And I think the grave mistake that a lot of companies have made, that I've watched happen and they fall prey to, is trying to fix themselves to what's happening now, or a moment, or a thing. And it's not necessarily authentic to their brand. It's not necessarily authentic to their values. It's not authentic to their purpose. And the most important and damning thing that can happen in that process is consumers see right through it. Businesses that you partner with, or have the potential or the desire to partner with, see right through it. And it feels transactional. And that's the kiss of death.
I think, and we've had a few of these conversations as well, just around when you are from outside looking in, and maybe you have a job, like what's many of the jobs that you've had, that you're hired to come in and somewhat galvanize or transform a culture. And there's many things that are stuck, or transform a brand, should I say, but leverage the culture that's there. Can you touch on a little bit around that, the challenges and / opportunities? Because I think there's kind of two pieces here. One is, yes, you've got these iconic brands that people can aspire to see and be, and it's like, well, how many Jordans are there, right? And then there's these new companies that are starting up and thinking, what principles can I align myself with in order to ensure that I put myself on the best track to create the most iconic possible brand for my organization?
Okay, so I'll talk quickly about FC Barcelona. So FC Barcelona is a soccer club. I'm a media and partnerships advisor for the club based here. For those of you who don't know, soccer is the world's most popular sport. FC Barcelona is one of the world's most popular sports brands. Lionel Messi, the most famous soccer player on the planet, is a product, even though he doesn't play for them now, is a product of FC Barcelona from when he was a kid. They brought him over as a tiny kid from Argentina and kind of developed him through the training academies and everything else. In Spain, but in the region where Barcelona plays, they're not, it's a religion. So forget about icons. It's like people live and die on it's crazy and slightly disturbing. And so what happens is, and they've been part of, the club's been around since 1899. They're part of the political fabric and have been for a long time. So for me to help kind of, even though a lot of people know them in the United States, people don't necessarily feel like, when you're a big brand and you travel, you have to make connections to the local populace, right? To the local culture. And you have to figure out how to navigate that. It's extremely difficult if you don't have people. So I'm the one who sort of explains, okay, that thing that works really well in Spain, or that thing that was easy in China, doesn't work in the United States. Soccer is the 5th most popular sport here, even though it's growing. They don't, like the cultural things that everyone at home thinks is really, those don't work here. But you have all these opportunities in terms of partnerships. So one is, I start, again, because of my background as a director producer, like, let's tell the great stories about the club that we're not telling them, but telling them with kind of an American accent, like in translation, so the locals understand it, and then you can kind of build it locally, because what will be FCB American brand will actually be different from the one that kind of got it to its iconic status.
That's interesting, because thinking about sports at large, and obviously consumers that you have that consume footwear and different things, they're your audience, right? And those are the folks that you're telling the stories to. So maybe talk a bit about some of your favorite stories, or stories that you think are worth telling, whether or not that's in the brands that you've worked with or ones that you've heard, who do you think tells a really good story to connect people to their brand, and what makes a good story?
So I'll tell a quick story. Kris made a reference to F1. So Formula One racing, European sport, big in Asia, not big in the United States. Was not big in the United States for whatever reason. It just didn't have any traction. And part of the reason it didn't have any traction is because it was basically run by kind of a Godfather type figure who would not allow his athletes to be on social media, who did not think about storytelling because the sport was doing so well in those markets that it didn't worry about it. It changes ownership to Liberty Media. Liberty Media says understanding the power of great storytelling, understanding that they have, young, good-looking drivers, fast cars, interesting team dynamics, and they're like, wait a second, like we're around all these garages. There's like Game of Thrones in this. So they tell a completely different story that doesn't have to appeal just to a sports fan. I have a 16-year-old daughter who I've been trying to get, since she was really small to like watch sports with me. She's indifferent. The only sport she'll watch is Formula One. One, because they do this great series on Netflix called Drive to Survive, and she just, and she loved the storylines behind it. So because of this thing that Netflix does, and Netflix didn't even have the rights to the races, actual Formula One races, it just completely grew in the United States. And that is completely a result of building a brand around personalities that people got to meet. Lewis Hamilton and some of the other racers, and some of the biggest stars have actually been some of the owners of the teams, and people kind of identifying with their frustrations, because it just feels, some of it can feel like The Office, or some of it can feel like Game of Thrones, but it's through kind of universally understood storylines and characters.
So I've got a question for the audience. So put your hand up if you're in tech. Okay, so how do we do this in tech? How do you tell great stories in tech? And I know that's a bit of a tough one, but it's like, how do you translate that in the same way? Because a lot of the stories we're touching on right now, sports, we've got F1, it sounds exciting to the outside, but when you maybe are not around the same types of people, the good-looking driver or whatever you want to say, how do you do that in tech?
Well, I'm just going to say, if you don't think that Tesla and Starlink and all the companies run by that gentleman are not based on him being whatever you think about him, right? And actually, the polarization is part of the point. But that is a high-tech company that is largely story-driven.
Okay,
That's actually a really good. I didn't know how you were going to answer that one, because I was sitting here like that's like way out of my wheelhouse. But it's interesting that you bring up polarization, because when I think about great storytelling, I always think about that emotional connection that you're making to consumers. And I never thought about what you juxtapose with that, because like that emotional thing is what everything has been rooted in. That we've seen, whether we turned on the NFL and Super Bowl and watched commercials over the years and years, that's what we typically see. But that's a really great answer.
Thank you.
As Tunde said, the creative genius, Armani.
I didn't say that. That's Tunde. Blame the AI.
Hold up. Before you go on, I want to ask the crowd a quick question. Are there any other examples of polarization in your space, in the tech space, like outside of the gentleman that he was just talking about?
It's not now because it's become so accepted, but when Facebook came out with Move Fast and Break Things, that was a deeply polarizing way to build a product, and they were going against the grain of, like, depending on where you want to put the marker, like 30 to 70 years of the industrial revolution was like the right way to do so. And I was a recruiter back then, and people would either like run towards a company that was adopting it, or were like, fuck no, I'll never work in that crazy ass environment.
Can I a quick follow up to that, and then so Move Fast and Break Things is now, with, again, same with Elon, like move fast and fire people, like when he took over. And that, because, one, it was kind of shocking, but it seems to have been adopted, like that it gave permission to so many other companies to kind of follow a similar thing, whether for good or for bad. But is that
Founder
similar?
Mode. Have you read that?
Founder mode, yeah. Founder mode, but that's different. That's firing mode.
Napster. When Napster first came out, it was larger than life for us, trading songs and computers.
That was pretty polarizing because that was trade right infringement, correct? Yeah.
Can I say something quick about that? Because Kris, you know the person I'm talking about. Actually, we all do. So a friend of mine was working at the Recording Industry Association. He's a lawyer at the time of Napster. And he's like, I can't believe these kids, they don't respect the law. I was like, bro, like that ship has sailed. Like it's a wrap. So just figure out how to contain it, but you're not going to be able to control it.
I would, yeah. So I'll switch gears slightly, not too much, but we were talking a lot about identity and what brands put out versus what they or who they actually are. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that sometimes, when we're talking about these trends, jumping on trends, how can you formulate an authentic culture and transform that into an authentic brand that allows you to basically connect with your customers? What are some of the critical ingredients in order to do that?
I'll jump in. I'd say the low-hanging fruit for your question is collaboration and partnership. It's actually a really good one. So if we kind of think about like brands that have had peaks and valleys, and the example I'm going to use is, don't laugh at me because it's like Louis Vuitton is like up here, so it's not necessarily like peaks and valleys, but there was a point where I'd say that they were, stale isn't the right word, but I'd say kind of staunch, kind of uppity, kind of, not necessarily for a multi-generational consumer base, not for a multicultural base. However, they made a couple of really, really, I'd say incredible moves. One was a hire, and then one was an incredible collaboration. And you can go to StockX and you can look at the prices, the resale prices for the collaboration, which I'll mention in a second. But they hired Virgil Abloh, and what that hire did for them was it recontextualized Louis Vuitton. It took it into different closets, different homes that it had never had an opportunity to be in, because these people never felt welcome going into those stores. I grew up in New York, and I know I never felt comfortable going in, walking down Fifth Avenue for obvious reasons. The second piece is the collaboration they did with Supreme. So they literally went into the streetwear space, which is like almost like a faux pas for any luxury brand to even take that level of risk and have the courage to do that. And again, go to StockX and you can see the original prices versus what the price is on those collaborative efforts today, and it'll clarify these examples that I'm framing up for you. But the point I'm making is, partnership and collaboration, the right partnership and collaboration can truly put brands in the right light, and also show their end users and consumers where their values sit and what their purpose is.
And I'm just going to summarize just some of those points, because are really insightful based on what we were talking about at the start, which is the polarization piece, taking risks, having courage to do so, but sticking to your identity. And I think that if you stick to your identity of who you actually are, it makes it easier for you to operate in that way. Maybe Armani, I don't know if you were gonna touch on a different topic, or you wanted to.
No, if that was a wrap. It's funny because I don't know if you're looking at my notes. You looking at my notes? Because I was going to mention Louis Vuitton, but no, it's a great example. And I would just say that Louis Vuitton, yes, they were like, the uppityness of the brand was the point of the brand. It was meant to be exclusive and to keep. And so what they should be applauded for is evolving. And they found in Virgil Abloh someone who respected what they had been, but said, look, I'm going to respect all these traditions. I'm going to work off some of these themes, but I'm going to be the bridge between what you were and what the world is now, and to do that. So to find the right people, especially when whether it's a pivot or, you know, extending of the brand to find the people so that you're doing it. Because I think Louis Vuitton felt, all right, we're still authentically Louis Vuitton, even though we're in deep water. And Virgil felt like, I'm not giving up any of my identity to work for this brand.
It seems like there's a connective tissue, right? Almost like a thread between what that brand was and what it could be, and somebody was able to come in and bridge that gap. And going back to that emotional piece and the human, we will talk about people. There are people that have made these big impacts there.
One thing that's really important with this example that I think is really critical to state: if you get after opportunities like the ones we're talking about, and you do it in an authentic way, and you do it without chasing something, meaning growth or revenue, what ends up happening, the result ends up being growth and revenue. So I just want to just acknowledge that, because he reignited that brand. And if you kind of hindsight over the last 5 years, like, growth was exponential with that house.
Just one quick thing. I think, Marcus, you're trying to give a more sort of accessible, maybe actionable insights. I think brands, whether they're small or big, just get in trouble by giving up like what got them there. That because culture is very often, they, you know, whether it's like early hip hop or skateboarding culture, they kind of form organically, and then sometimes, and when you're building a company that's gonna, you know, we're gonna have a relationship to consumers or to other businesses, like taking the time to figure out, you know, and being disciplined about, oh, this is what we are, because you don't think about it. It's like natural. It's like walking. You don't think, you know, but to think about, all right, this is what our story is, and then be disciplined about the process of disseminating, you know, that story. Right? So, and anyone can do that.
Yeah, and to build upon that, some of the companies that I've seen that have done it really well have taken their culture and their brand and created community. And they've invested in that community, and they let the community become the ears and the eyes for them around where we should go and how can we behave authentically. And I think sometimes the kind of conflict is between what the community expected and maybe what you do internally, and then what your shareholders expect as well, right? So those are some of the challenges. I'm not entirely sure how we are for time. Can anybody give me any signal whatsoever? Okay, so we got 10 minutes left. One of the questions that I wanted to ask was around, and we touched on it briefly, was around innovator's dilemma, which is the language of the Bay Area, and so, like, we understand that. What advice would you give to those that are facing this innovator's dilemma from a standpoint of reinventing and building their brand when things are going pretty well and we're doing all right and we're kind of going in the right direction? How can a company overcome that? And Armani, I'll ask you that question to start on. Unless Kris, you want to chime in.
Yeah, it's funny. Armani actually nailed it a few minutes ago when he touched on it. I'm going to recontextualize it. I'm not repackaging.
Please.
Just recontextualize it. I think that the key is just for brands not to go in risk mitigation mode. And what I mean by that is it's really easy to kind of go in a corner and play it safe once you've kind of made it to where you wanted to make it. But what you risk in doing that is plateauing. So I'll just give an example. The example you use was specific to HBO and the fact that they essentially had an old boy network. That wasn't the word you used, but I'm just reusing, recontextualizing it. But what happens if, on a lot of organizations that I've personally worked in, is that the organizations are basically homogenous. And what ends up happening is, in the absence of people who are from the communities you serve, who are the voice of those communities, you kind of lose the plot of what it is you're trying to do and what's actually gonna move the market and move consumers. Essentially, what I've become, I'm the voice for the voiceless in the boardroom. If there's no me and there's no people who look like me in the boardrooms I sit in, I get really concerned and nervous that the voice of the communities we serve is simply just going to be absent. And when I say that, it's not just people who look like me, it's people who look vastly different across numerous cultures, numerous ethnicities, but that is really important. And also, there's also the generational piece of it as well. Having new voices in, new thinking in, young, old, the whole thing is really important.
Well, so one of the takeaways I have from that is perspective, right? So when you're in that environment, you want to ensure that you're encompassing the perspective of your community, your audience, and your members. I know we had 10 minutes ago, probably about 3 minutes ago, 10 minutes left. So what I'm thinking, unless Armani, you want to chime in, is I'd love to give the audience a chance to ask any questions that they may have, and we go to Q&A. If any of you are wondering, and I'm going to jump in my shameless plug, what that QR code is up there. This is to give you access, early access to Tunde AI, who you heard speak at the start, which is our trusted advisor that we use internally, but we've now released to the world as of today to give people access to what they need as far as having collaboration, brainstorming as executives. So feel free, it's free to try, free to use for now with this small group as we start to scale. So I just wanted to mention that, but without further ado, anybody got any questions?
I'm going to quickly jump on your shameless plug, because it was a shameless plug, so let's not get it twisted. But you know, Marcus and I are friends. We're also LinkedIn friends. We communicate, and one of the things that I really have been impressed by is the way that you've been building this product, like in public, like largely on LinkedIn. And I think there is, kind of related to this conversation, I think there's really something about, like, I can see the sort of seeds of a great brand being building because of your authentic willingness to be like, all right, that didn't work out. Having people follow that journey and follow the stride. So I just want to applaud you for that.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. It looks like we've got a couple of questions, a few questions. So we'll go straight down the middle.
Talking about why didn't Blockbuster lean in and figure out Netflix or any of the other examples? There was a fellow who unpacked that for Honeywell and Nest, and saying, like, what was different. And in that case, it was a product conversation. He was looking at like a design tacked on at the end after the engineers are done with it versus a design-driven, design-led organization. And I'm wondering, is there something in brand building that you wish was like much more part of how people thought about engaging with the community, that maybe is just on a leading edge right now, or just kind of needs to be less tacked on at the end and more like the heart of it all the way through?
So baking it into the DNA of how you build by design, right? Like, what could you do when you're setting up, and maybe when you're setting up a new brand or you're starting something, what can you bake in to ensure that you're staying true to your purpose, mission, and that brand? Is that fair to say? Or different?
Yeah, I mean, design was seen as this thing you tack on at the end.
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of the time, especially in early startup, founders are so busy that it's hard to do all of the community building and storytelling that you could be doing while the stories are happening. So is there a way to approach that, especially in the early days, that, because it is when the culture's being built.
So I don't know the Honeywell Nest story. That I have Honeywell actually in my home, but going back to the Netflix Blockbuster, I mean, one of the things with Netflix is they were not consumed with storytelling early. They were like, let's get this product to work. So you don't have to necessarily. It's more important that you build your internal story, that you recognize the need to have a story that will once go out. And now, like Mark Randolph, I think, who's one of the CEO, the lesser known, but one of the like co-founders of Netflix, talks a lot about the building of that. And I think their kind of North Star was understanding, because Blockbuster would not have called itself a tech company. Netflix, even when it was sending DVDs through the mail, understood it was fundamentally, and people weren't going to understand that, like that. We're a tech company. The internet is evolving. We're going to be there eventually. This is sort of our gateway. So sometimes it's really just a matter of like understanding the need to do the story, but really just kind of focusing on your business, focusing on your culture, and then the story part comes next.
Great. I think we've got a question here as well.
Yeah. So my question is particularly for very small companies. How do you avoid, in your quest to brand build, becoming a cult of personality? Right. So you described, for example, Tesla and Elon Musk, and to a certain extent, it's a cult of personality around a person, right? And so how can you, especially when you are just a company of maybe a few people or one visionary leader or something like that? I don't know. Any recommendations on how to make sure that you're not putting all your eggs in the basket of one human being?
I think a lot of it has to do with the culture of the company. So I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I listen to a fair amount of tech or business podcasts where there are often people who are in the relatively early phase, startup phase of tech or media companies, and you can always tell the difference between. And sometimes it's one person. It's their idea. They kind of built it, but very often that person is just given props, given flowers to all the people around them, and I gravitate to that way of articulating that story. Some people don't want to do that. Some people, it really is just kind of me, which is a different thing. And sometimes, those companies do prosper. I think Facebook is maybe a case of that. But typically for small businesses, I think if, and I don't know if you're speaking for yourself, if you're the person behind that company, is figuring out the way to craft a narrative that is really inclusive of the people who you're working with, and being really diligent about that in your communications, whether you're on a podcast or writing your blog, but just having it be about your team. It's also going to be unbelievably, I think, helpful with recruiting, once you get to that next stage.
I just wanted to add something on that, just from being in a 30,000 employee company and running part of that, and then being a small business. And I think you use your network and who you are to get started and jumpstart, but ultimately the story of the company has to be bigger than you. And I think if you think of it in that way and you craft that story that you're going to grow into, and that's bigger than you, the people around you gravitate towards that. And we started with community first, and we find that wherever we go, all right, put your hands up if you know EQ. There are people that know us. And so I think it's about bringing that to it as well.
Did you make it yourself? No, imagine that really stupid. Because what I'm hoping is simplicity in the answer to people are necessary. Or if you're trying to go from 0 to 1 on a brand, let's say I want to make a universe. I want to build a brand with a story that's bigger than this piece. But I'm just getting started. What's your basic, or you don't know that much about this yet, advice or guidance in terms of how to get started? So that might be tell one story 50 different times, 50 different ways. Do not move on from that first story until, I'm not saying this right, really just simplify it for me. How do you start feeling around stairs? Where do you start your best with that? Does that make sense?
I can answer that.
Yeah, please.
I think it always goes back to the purpose. And we hear this so many times here, and it's having that clear purpose that everybody can gravitate to. And that is your guiding principle and your guiding light. We call that obviously North Star out here, but making sure that that's not just said, but it's embodied with your actions. And those around you then tell that story for you. There was this one guy that I was at a company, Adecco, it's a $24 billion business. One of the guys was running a big market in Italy. It was probably about $3 or $4 billion business. Every time I spoke to somebody about that person, I heard exactly the same message. And he had cultivated his personal brand, and I think you can do the same with the company brand.
But yeah, brand is like, obviously you build a personal brand, or someone builds a small company or a big company brand, but the only important thing about brand is what people on the outside think of you. So other companies could have said, just do it, and okay, and that was it. Like, hey, we just come up with these 3 words that cohere. But no, they there was a culture that was built. So figure out kind of, to what Marcus says, and then figure out kind of what those stories are, so that the conversations people are having around you support what you're trying to do.
So unfortunately, I think we're at time now. And so we're gonna maybe do some parting words. Is there anything that, Kris, you'd like to say as we depart?
I just want to say thank you again for having us. And more importantly, we really, really appreciate the level of engagement and the great questions that you all asked. Thank you.
Thank you to the Responsive Conference for having us. Really appreciate it. And thank you all for showing up and for the great questions. So
You're all amazing. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it.